Right, let's take you back here now. And upon gaining independence in 1957, Ghanaian politician Dr. Kwame Nkrumah said, "We have awakened. We will not sleep anymore. Today, from now on, there's a new Africa in the world." Yet 63 years down the road, the continent appears to be in a state of slumber. A lot may have been achieved globally, but life has stood still for many on the African continent due to corruption, illicit financial outflows, conflict, and weak leadership. Now, let's get into discussion for more on the state of affairs of the continent and the true cost of corruption. I'm joined by Professor Patrick Lumumba. He's a professor of public law and former director of Kenya's Anti-Corruption Commission. A very good afternoon to you, and thank you so much, Prof, for joining us this afternoon. In 2020, we still find ourselves talking about the true potential of the African continent and how we can reach our potential. It would seem that we are a very long way from where the likes of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah and Haile Selassie would have liked to see us. What do you perceive is going on the continent?
It's true. Kwame was right. On the eve of independence, we thought that we would gain economic independence. Remember, it is Kwame who famously said, "Seek ye first the political kingdom, and the rest will be given unto you." But it would appear that that has not happened, and Africa continues to punch below her weight. Yet, commentators agree that potentially it is the richest continent. If you look at the kind of wealth that is found in the Democratic Republic of Congo as an example, it is a paradox that we still continue to wallow in abject poverty. And corruption has played a major role. Indeed, you will remember that last year, the African Union did designate the year 2019 as a year for the elimination of corruption in the continent of Africa. But of course, the year came and the year went, and corruption is alive and well. It is alive and well because those whom we have entrusted with political leadership have squandered the opportunity to fight corruption with the kind of vigor that it deserves. And it is noteworthy that even during these very difficult periods of COVID-19, those entrusted with funds are embezzling those funds. It is a tragedy of gigantic proportions. A friend of mine, Boima Fanbule from Liberia, described the situation in the following terms: theft on an industrial scale to the detriment of the people of Africa.
Theft on an industrial scale to the detriment of the people. Many would argue that Africans did not invent corruption. Your retort to that?
Oh, without doubt. Corruption is not grown in Africa. This is something that started, and I think when the colonialists came here, they really watered the tree of corruption. You will know, for example, that the British, the French, the Belgians, the Germans, and all of them who were the colonizers were themselves the perpetrators of corruption. And even today, the funds that are stolen in Africa are actually stashed away in Paris, in London, or their dependent territories. The Africans watch them engaging in corruption, and there is a sense in which we have perfected the art. And that is a tragedy because they have, of course, reduced corruption in a fundamental way and punished those who are involved in corruption. The tragedy in Africa, of course, is that those who engage in corruption are not punished. Instead, they are elected into public office. In many African countries, people join politics because it is the shortest route to unearned wealth.
On that point of people joining politics because it is the shortest route to gaining wealth, just with the context that you have given, that perhaps, yes, Africans did not invent corruption, but it is more personal because this is home, and when you see the lack of development that is happening on the continent, it's even more painful. And now in a country like South Africa, where some over 90 companies are being investigated by the Special Investigating Unit for Corruption, what then do we do with those politicians politicians that we have entrusted so much with when they have their hands in the cookie jar in some way they shouldn't have?
There is a sense in which the population is also complicit in corruption. In many African countries, the political process itself is corrupt, and people have been made to believe that until and unless a politician pays out a bribe, then they are not worthy of being elected. But that is not to say that the greater responsibility lies with the political class. But anger is very important. I don't think that people in the African continent are angry enough to fight corruption. We have seen anger in countries such as Hungary. We have seen anger in countries in Eastern Europe. And we have seen situations where people have been driven out of office when the people became angry. We saw these in Tunisia. We saw these in Egypt. We saw these in Algeria during the Arab Spring. But in the African continent, your typical thieving politician has a knack of hypnotizing people on the basis of ethnic affiliation. And therefore, they very quickly recede into their ethnic cocoons, and then they gain protection. And when you want to punish them, then they claim that their ethnic group is being punished. But there is a sense in which in the recent past, a number of African countries are beginning to relate the suffering of the people to corruption, and people are being punished, or the stolen wealth is being recovered. We have seen this in Nigeria with the Abacha loot. We have seen this in the Democratic Republic of Congo with the Mobutu loot. We have seen it, or we are seeing it in your own country in South Africa, the indictment of President Zuma. These are movements and steps which ought to be celebrated, because it sends a very strong message that there will be no impunity, and if your hand is in the cookie jar, will hit you where it hurts most, will take away your liberty and take away your wealth, because you cannot be allowed to drink from the poison chalice.
Is a lack of consequences on this continent, we're oftentimes called the consequenceless society, who oftentimes gets into bed with the likes of China, a very corrupt, anti-corruption country where they do not tolerate it. Should you be found doing something wrong, you will be dealt with. Do we find that we act with impunity because there are no consequences on this continent?
Oh, you are completely right. And it's not only China. For a long time, France used to factor corruption as a business expense. And when they came into Africa, whether through Total or ELF or any of those other entities, they would engage in activities that were underpinned by corruption. That is how the regimes were perpetuated: the Mobutu kleptocracy, the Bokassa kleptocracy in Central African Republic, the Blaise Compaoré kleptocracy in Burkina Faso, and many other kleptocracies were actually underpinned by these European powers. Of course, the journey come lately into the arena is China, which punishes corruption at home in China, but yet dances with the lords of corruption in Africa, because they know that this is the arena of impunity. So it is incumbent upon us as Africans to begin to make demands of our politicians and to require that individuals be punished. And that anger, I believe, is beginning to manifest itself in a very clear way, and politicians are beginning to get punished. And I think that it will happen. It's not going to be easy. It's like the Titanic turning. It turns, but you never quite see the movement, but it's turning nevertheless.
What would you say the true cost of corruption on the African continent has been?
You know, monumental. Monumental in every sector. A continent that ought to be the breadbasket of the world still imports food. It has affected agriculture. A continent that ought to have facilities to treat our people cannot do so because it affects the health sector. A continent that ought to have quality facilities in the education sector is not doing so. A continent that ought to be involved in innovation and the invention is not doing so. Huge impact.
Huge impact. I don't think I know a continent that gets more aid than the African continent. South Africa just yesterday getting money from the International Monetary Fund. And so we see ourselves perpetually cap in hand asking for money from Western powers. What do you perceive is going on there where that money is also doesn't reach the people that it is intended to reach? Professor Lumumba, it's Dudu. Are you still there?
Can you repeat the question?
I don't think there is a continent that gets more aid than the African continent. South Africa yesterday securing more money from the International Monetary Fund in the form of a loan. And it's not the only country. Yet that money does not get to the people that it is intended to get to most of the time. What do you perceive is going on there?
Because we mismanage our affairs, we've got to borrow, to use the old English saying, from Peter to pay Paul. And yet we are quite clear that aid does not help. The young Zambian economist Dambisa Moyo has written a very good book, Bad Aid. You cannot solve your problems by borrowing. And what happens in many African countries is that the money is borrowed and embezzled, so that the burden is once again imposed on the population. And I think it is now necessary for parliaments in countries such as South Africa to require the executive arm of the government to borrow only when it is absolutely necessary. South Africa is a rich country, in fact, the biggest economy in the continent of Africa. If it is also suffering, then that is a testament to the situation in the rest of the continent. And I am of the considered view that going forward, we ought to be very careful how we borrow. I remember in the 1980s, the Latin American countries led by Chile and Brazil took the view that in order to realize real economic development, you must liberate yourself from the clutches of the International Monetary Fund and the Bretton Woods institutions. That is what we must do. Going forward, we should strengthen the African Development Bank and capitalize it properly. And we control our resources and use our resources in a judicious manner. And in that way, the continent would be better served.
It was again Papa Kwame Nkrumah in giving his independence speech that talked about the independence of Ghana meaning nothing if it is not tied to the liberation of the rest of the continent. Yet here we sit in 2020 where intra-Africa trade is at its lowest level ever. I don't think it's beyond or above 20%. Why is it that we are not able to get together and work together as a continent to achieve this greatness that we have?
There are a number of things that must be put into perspective. That very early on, Africans did recognize the need to work together. But the erstwhile colonial power was also hard at work, dividing us, so that Africa is variously described as a francophone, with the French very active to ensure that the former colonies are simply backyards, including controlling their economies and their currency. The Portuguese were equally hard at work. The British were also hard at work. In their usual subtle manner, they talked about indirect rule through the Commonwealth and all those things. Of course, the Americans also were hard at work. So there is a sense in which there is external manipulation. But that is not good enough reason. In 1980, African countries met in Abuja, in Lagos in Nigeria, and came up with the Lagos Plan of Action. And the Lagos Plan of Action was informed by the realization that intra-African trade was at a very low level. If you compare Africa to Europe, you compare Africa to Asia, you compare Africa to North America and Latin America. And that was in 1980. Nothing happened. We then, of course, started creating regional blocs such as ECOWAS, East African Community, SADC, and we now know that if we don't work as a team, if we are not coordinated and united, then we will continue to be weak. And that is the essence of Africa Agenda 2063, based on 7 pillars and informed by the realization that we will only improve our economies if we trade within the continent. And the African Continental Free Trade Area, which ought to have commenced in the month of July this year and has now been postponed to January next year because of COVID-19, is in itself one of the biggest steps that will possibly be made. It will make Africa the biggest free trade area with a population of nearly 1.3 billion. And I hope that we remain faithful to the script, because if we don't, then we become fodder for hungry countries such as China, whose appetite for African resources and African material is insatiable. So I hope that this time round we have learned our lesson and that COVID has given us an opportunity for introspection, and that going forward we will do that which is good and right in the best interest of the continent of Africa. And countries such as South Africa, which have large economies in the context of Africa, and Nigeria, and Ethiopia, and even Kenya and Tanzania, must now begin to play leading roles in driving this agenda forward. And it will indeed be our only salvation, because Charles Darwin is still right. Might is right in this world, and survival is for the fittest, and death is for the least suitable.
You mentioned the so-called big economies on the African continent, South Africa, Nigeria, and many others. But I would like to ask you a question in terms of democracy. If we're seeing democracy working in some of these countries which are plagued by corruption. A country like Rwanda, for instance, say what you will about Paul Kagame, but that country works for Rwandans.
Oh, without that. I give kudos to President Paul Kagame. I also give kudos to the President of Tanzania, John Joseph Pombo Magufuli, because they have demonstrated in the recent past that when you are disciplined, when you have identified your priorities, when you work at it and work consistently, then within a generation or less, you can lift the majority of the people from the quicksand of poverty into the hard ground of dignity and progress. And you've brought in the question of democracy. You know, I think that that is the one area where Africa must be bold enough. You know, Europe defines for us what democracy is. America defines for us what democracy is. And they expect us to swallow their prescriptions line, hook, and sinker. What is democracy from where I sit? Democracy is an environment which allows people to participate in the conduct of the affairs of their nation. And there is no one-size-fits-all democracy. The sooner we realize that, the safer we will be. And if we realize that and we begin to ensure that our processes of governance are participatory, then we will not be saddled with Eurocentric definitions of what constitutes democracy.
What role does the cultural or the heritage project have to play in moving the African continent forward? A lot of our artifacts do not even sit on the African continent. They're in museums in London. What role does it play in helping people identify and know who they are, where they come from, in order to build that which they had before? Or even better.
You know, the Europeans simply stole our artifacts. We don't want to use the word theft. That is exactly what happened. You go to the British Museum, you go to the Louvre, you go to the Guggenheim museums in Europe. They are storing stolen property. And one of the things that frustrates me most is that I don't hear the voice of the African Union loud enough. I would want to hear the voice of the African Union speaking confidently and consistently and demanding that all stolen artifacts be returned to the continent of Africa. Because tourism that is based on heritage is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And if we were to recognize that, see what the Germans did amongst the Herero in Namibia, see what the British did in Egypt, see what they have done in different parts of Africa, we must make demands. Even this idea of forgiveness of debt, the debt should actually be forgiven, and I'm using the word very loosely, as the beginning of reparation for the theft, the grand larceny that was undertaken by the colonizing powers in the continent of Africa. And the sooner we have that done, the safer we are. I remember in 1985, the former president of Burkina Faso, Noel Isidore Thomas Sankara, spoke very eloquently and passionately in Addis Ababa saying, we must have reparations. That voice died. That voice should now be reactivated so that we make demand. See how the Jews have made the world feel guilty because of the Holocaust. But we forget that King Leopold of the Belgians killed 15 million Congolese. The Jews killed in the Holocaust were 6 million. I'm not saying it was a horrible thing, but who talks about the slaughter and the genocide of King Leopold of the Belgians? Who talks about the fact that Belgium is because Congo is not? This is what we are talking about.
A final word from you, sir, to the everyday African. We spoke about anger a little bit earlier on and how we need to get a little bit more angrier and impatient with the state of affairs. But your message to the everyday African citizen that is fed up with the way in which we are going?
We cannot afford the luxury of giving up. We cannot afford the luxury of engaging in perpetual lamentation. Democracy and good governance requires the eternal vigilance of the population. We must be vigilant. We must be bold. We must be brave. We must make demands of our politicians. We must ensure that the politicians do not reap where they have not sown. We must tell politicians that they are midwives. And a midwife is neither the mother, nor the father, nor the child. His or her duty is to ensure that the child is delivered. If we make demands of them, then history has demonstrated not once, not twice, that where the citizens are vigilant, the right thing will be done. It is not for the faint-hearted, but we cannot lose. We cannot lose. It is intergenerational. We cannot lose. We will win.
We cannot lose. Professor Patrick Lumumba, it's been a great pleasure being in conversation with you this afternoon. Asante sana.
Asante sana.